You see me now, perhaps, as the woman who stood tall, who delivered the definitive blow in a courtroom. You see the numbers, $3.2 million, and think of triumph. But to truly understand that moment, to truly feel the weight of what was won, you must first understand the girl who almost lost everything. The girl whose brilliance was dimming under the shadow of a man who called her passion a cute hobby. That girl was me, Evelyn. And this is my story. Long before the courtroom drama, long before the millions. I was always, for lack of a better word, different. While other kids were outside, covered in mud, chasing fleeting games, I was inside, meticulously organizing my crayon box by hue, dissecting old radios, or, once we got our first clunky PC, completely lost in the glow of the screen. My world wasn't loud. It was ordered, logical, a symphony of zeros and ones that made infinitely more sense than the chaotic, unpredictable nature of human emotion. I gravitated towards coding like a moth to a flame. Lines of syntax, algorithms, the elegant dance of logic. It was a language I understood intrinsically. There was a profound satisfaction in building something from nothing, in seeing a complex problem yield to a perfectly crafted solution. It was my escape, my sanctuary, a place where I felt profoundly capable and utterly safe. In those early days, sitting hunched over a keyboard, building simple games or automating mundane tasks, I wasn't just programming, I was dreaming of building something truly impactful, something that would solve real problems, something that would leave a mark. My parents, God bless them, were supportive in their own gentle, slightly bewildered way. They didn't understand what I did with those glowing screens, but they saw my quiet joy, my intense focus. "Our Evelyn is so smart," my mother would say, beaming whenever I fixed the printer or explained the internet to her for the 10th time. "She's going to invent something amazing one day." They were proud, yes, but also naive. They encouraged my talent, but lacked the street smarts, the protective cynicism to shield me from the kind of people who prey on quiet brilliance. Their world was simpler, governed by hard work and good intentions. They taught me to trust, to believe in the best in people, a lesson that, in retrospect, left me vulnerable. They gave me wings, but they didn't teach me how to spot the wolves. And then, in my senior year of college, came Mark. He was everything I wasn't: loud, charming, effortlessly charismatic. He commanded a room, laughed easily, and had a magnetic pull that I, the quiet coder, found utterly captivating. I was drawn to his light, like a plant to the sun, convinced he could fill the spaces within me that felt socially awkward or incomplete. He studied business, always talking about big deals, grand ventures. He seemed to appreciate my intellect, my unique perspective, as he put it. He'd sit beside me in the lab, watching me code, his eyes wide with feigned admiration. "Evelyn, you're brilliant," he'd say, a line that felt like liquid gold to my starved ego. "You're going to change the world, and I'm going to be right there with you." I fell hard. He wasn't like the other boys who found my passion for tech intimidating. He seemed to embrace it, or so I thought. He was the confident, outgoing counterpart to my introverted intensity. He validated me in ways I desperately craved. He made me feel seen, not just as a coder, but as a woman. Looking back, the red flags were there, waving furiously, but I was too enamored to see them. Or perhaps I simply rationalized them away. He'd subtly steer conversations towards his ambitions, always with him at the center. My achievements, even small ones, would be acknowledged briefly, then folded into a larger narrative of our future. If I talked about a coding challenge, he'd quickly pivot to how we could monetize it. His ideas always grand, yet always lacking any actual technical understanding or effort. He'd get intensely jealous if I spent too much time on my projects, framing it as me neglecting us. "You spend more time with your code than with me, Evelyn," he'd say, his voice laced with wounded accusation. I'd feel a pang of guilt, believing I was truly being unfair, never questioning why his need for attention always trumped my need for creative space. I mistook his control for passion, his jealousy for devotion. I truly believed he was just intensely invested in us, in our shared future. While still in college, I started to develop a simple but effective task management app. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was intuitive, bug-free, and based on some unique algorithms I'd developed. My professors were impressed. A small angel investor even expressed casual interest. I excitedly showed it to Mark. I remember the evening clearly. We were in my cramped dorm room, the screen of my laptop illuminating my face with eager anticipation. I watched his expression, hoping for the same admiration he'd shown for my abstract coding problems. He peered at the screen, nodded slowly, then patted my head. "That's cute, Ev," he said, using the affectionate nickname that now tasted like ash in my mouth. "A really cute little hobby. Good for you. It won't compete with the big players. You're too sweet, too focused on the technical details. You need a business mind like mine to actually make something of it." The word stung. Cute hobby. It dismissed months of painstaking work, countless sleepless nights, and the spark of genuine innovation. He didn't offer to help, he offered a dismissive platitude, subtly positioning himself as the superior, business-minded one, while simultaneously undermining my creation. He saw it as a toy, not a tool, certainly not a stepping stone to a career. This app eventually fizzled, not because it was bad, but because his subtle, constant discouragement chipped away at my confidence, making me question its worth. That night, after he'd gone, I sat alone, staring at the lines of code that represented so much of my heart. The joy I usually felt was replaced by a dull ache. It wasn't just a dismissive comment, it was a blueprint for our future. He wasn't seeing my vision, he was seeing his version of me, the smart, quiet girl who could build cool things, but who would always need him to give them purpose and value. This was Evelyn, before the courtroom, before the millions. A girl on the precipice of a future she couldn't yet imagine, walking blindly into a partnership that would nearly cost her everything. But the seeds of defiance, the silent spark of innovation, were already being watered by the very dismissals that sought to drown them. And soon, those seeds would grow into something neither of us could have ever predicted. We were married on a crisp October afternoon. To the outside world, we were the ultimate power couple, the charming business visionary and the brilliant tech architect. Mark gave a toast that brought half the room to tears, talking about how I was his North Star. I believed him. I floated through that day convinced that any red flags I'd seen in college were just growing pains. I thought marriage would be the ultimate firewall, protecting us from the world. But the firewall wasn't built to protect us. Mark was building it to isolate me. The honeymoon period didn't just end, it was replaced by a calculated restructuring of our reality. It started with the joint vision talk. "Ev, if we're going to build a legacy, we need to be smart. You're the creative genius, but you lose track of the details. Why don't you let me handle the boring stuff, the bills, the investments, the boring bank meetings, so you can focus on your little projects?" It sounded like a gift. It felt like support. I was working a high-level developer job at a firm that valued me, and my salary was substantial. Mark's business ventures, however, were always in the pre-revenue phase. He had big ideas for consulting firms and real estate flips, but they always required an initial injection of capital. My capital. Within 6 months, my paycheck was being deposited into a joint account I barely checked. Whenever I wanted to buy a new high-end workstation or attend a tech conference in San Francisco, Mark would sigh. He'd bring up a spreadsheet and show me how tight things were.
We really need to be careful this month, Ev. My new venture is just about to break through, and we need every cent for the marketing push. Can't your workstation wait? I was the one earning 90% of the household income, yet I was the one asking for an allowance. He turned my own success into a burden I had to apologize for. He made me feel like my spending was selfish, while his investments, which usually involved expensive dinners with potential partners and a closet of designer suits, were necessary for our future. This was how he controlled me, not with outright threats, but with this insidious compounding of minute controls, each rationalized as acts of protection. He slowly rewrote the rules of our relationship, and I, the gullible coder, continued to see his manipulation as his desire to protect me, not to control and isolate me. He worked from home, his usual pretext being that he was in the middle of a major deal.
The financial control was just the exterior wall. The real damage was being done inside my head. Mark developed a specialized language for undermining me. He never told me I was stupid. He told me I was unrealistic. He never said my work was bad. He said it was unmarketable. I remember coming home one day, buzzing with excitement about a breakthrough I'd made in data encryption. I tried to explain the elegance of the logic to him. He didn't even look up from his phone. "That's great, honey, but who's actually going to buy that? It sounds like something only a nerd would care about. You need to stop wasting your energy on these deep dive technicalities and start thinking about what people actually want. You know, like the ideas I have." He'd take my ideas, strip them of their complexity, and then present a hollowed-out version of them at dinner parties as if they were his own. I'd sit there, stunned, listening to him butcher the logic of a system I'd spent weeks designing, while our friends nodded in awe of his visionary mind. If I tried to correct him, he'd laugh it off later. "Don't be so sensitive, Ev. I was just making it digestible for them. You're too close to the code. You can't see the big picture." By the third year, the erosion reached my career. I was offered a promotion to lead architect, a role I'd dreamed of. When I told Mark, he didn't celebrate. He looked worried. "Lead architect, Ev? That's a lot of responsibility. Are you sure you're ready for that? The stress, the late nights? I've noticed you've been a bit frazzled lately. I'm just worried about your mental health. Maybe you should stay in your current role. It's safer. It gives us more time to focus on starting a family." He used my own potential for motherhood as a weapon against my ambition. He planted seeds of doubt until I started to believe them. I turned down the promotion. I stayed small. I stayed safe. And as I shrank, Mark grew. He used the stability of my job to take even bigger risks with our money, eventually borrowing $40,000 from my 401k without telling me until the papers were already signed. "It was a sure thing, Ev. I did it for us. Why don't you ever trust me?" It was in that moment of absolute betrayal, the theft of my retirement savings, that something shifted. The safe Evelyn, the unrealistic Evelyn, finally hit a hard, cold floor. I realized that if I stayed on this path, there would be nothing left of me. Mark wasn't my partner. He was a parasite. I didn't scream. I didn't pack a bag. I knew him too well. He would charm me back or guilt-trip me into staying. I needed a way out that he couldn't touch. That night, I opened a hidden partition on my personal laptop. I started a new directory. I named it Project Phoenix. Phoenix wasn't just code. It was a revolutionary AI-driven scalability tool for cloud infrastructure. It was the solution to a problem I'd seen at my firm for years, something no one else was addressing because it was too technical. Mark called it a nerdy deep dive, but in the quiet hours of 2 a.m. while Mark was snoring in the other room, Project Phoenix became my rebellion. For the next year, I lived a double life. During the day, I was the frazzled wife, the reliable but uninspired developer, the woman who let her husband handle the real business. I played the part perfectly. I stopped arguing about the finances. I let him take credit for my small ideas. I made myself as unremarkable as possible. But at night, I was a god.
I was building an architecture that was faster, leaner, and more powerful than anything on the market. Every time Mark insulted me, I'd write 10 more lines of code. Every time he spent my money on a business lunch, I'd optimize a new algorithm. Project Phoenix was fueled by my anger, shaped by my brilliance, and protected by my silence. Mark would walk into the room while I was working, and I'd quickly switch the screen to a mindless game or a shopping site. "Still tinkering with your little hobby, Ev?" he'd ask with that condescending smirk. "Just passing the time, Mark," I'd reply with my heart hammering against my ribs. He had no idea that little hobby was the blueprint for a multi-million-dollar acquisition. He had no idea while he was planning how to spend my next paycheck, I was planning my resurrection. The end came not with a bang, but with a piece of paper. I found a receipt in Mark's suit pocket, an expensive piece of jewelry, a diamond necklace I had never seen. I checked our joint savings. It was nearly empty. He wasn't just stealing my money for failed businesses anymore. He was spending it on someone else. I didn't confront him. I didn't cry. I felt a strange, icy clarity. I took a screenshot of the bank statement, a photo of the receipt, and I emailed them to a divorce attorney I'd been researching in secret. Then I went back to my laptop. I ran the final test on Project Phoenix. The results were perfect, 100% efficiency. "Mark," I said that evening as he walked through the door, "I want a divorce." He laughed. He actually laughed. "A divorce, Ev? You can't even handle your own bank account. You'd be lost without me in a week. Don't be dramatic." "I'm not being dramatic," I said, looking him dead in the eye for the first time in years. "I'm being realistic." He didn't know it yet, but the woman he thought he'd broken had already built a kingdom he would never be allowed to enter. The divorce was just the legal formality. The real battle was about to begin, and for the first time in our marriage, I was the one holding all the cards. The first thing I noticed about my new life wasn't the lack of money, it was the lack of noise. Mark's constant voice, the critiques, the sighs, the loud phone calls about his imminent millions was gone. For the first few nights in my $900 a month studio apartment, the silence was so loud it made my ears ring. I had a mattress on the floor, a single folding chair, and a desk I'd scavenged from a sidewalk. But on that desk was my workstation, and inside that workstation was Project Phoenix. Mark had successfully drained our joint accounts before the temporary freeze took effect. He'd left me with exactly $1,400 to my name and a car that needed a transmission. Most people would have seen this as a catastrophe. I saw it as the cost of admission to my own life. I was broke, but for the first time in a decade, I was the only person with the password to my brain. People think coding is just typing. They don't realize it's architecture. It's building a city where every pipe has to flow and every wire has to connect perfectly or the whole thing goes dark. I lived on caffeine and canned soup. My office was a 5-foot radius around my desk, while Mark was likely at some upscale bar telling anyone who would listen how he made me and how bitter I was. I was solving the problem of cloud latency. Project Phoenix was becoming a monster, a beautiful, efficient monster. I was developing a proprietary algorithm that predicted server load before it happened. It wasn't just a hobby, it was the holy grail of cloud infrastructure. Every time I fixed a bug, I felt like I was fixing a piece of my soul that Mark had tried to break. I'd spend 20 straight hours at the monitor. My eyes would burn, my back would ache, but I was happy. I was building. I wasn't Evelyn, the frazzled wife. I was Evelyn, the lead architect of her own destiny. 3 months into my monk-like existence, I hit a milestone. I pushed a beta version of the core engine to a private GitHub repository. I didn't expect much, but I knew the right people were watching. A week later, I got an email. It wasn't from a recruiter. It was from the head of acquisitions at Nexus Dynamics, a Tier 1 global tech firm. My heart didn't just beat, it hammered. They wanted to see a demo. They wanted a technical deep dive. They didn't care about my business vision. They cared about my code. I spent 3 days preparing. I didn't buy new clothes. I cleaned my studio until it sparkled. When the Zoom call started, I didn't hide my surroundings.
I sat in my folding chair, wore my favorite old hoodie, and talked for 2 hours about data packets and predictive modeling. At the end of the call, the lead architect at Nexus Dynamics didn't call it a cute hobby. He sat back, rubbed his chin, and said, "Evelyn, this is the most elegant solution to load balancing I've seen in a decade. We need to talk about a potential exclusive licensing deal or an acquisition." I was on a high. For the first time, the millions weren't a Mark-style fantasy, they were a mathematical probability. I was walking back to my apartment after buying a celebratory $4 cupcake when a man in a nondescript suit was waiting by my door. "Evelyn Vance?" "Yes." "You've been served." He handed me a thick envelope and walked away. I stood in the hallway, the cupcake box in one hand and the legal death knell in the other. I went inside, sat on my floor, and pulled out the papers. Not just a small monthly payment. He was claiming $8,000 a month in spousal support. He was claiming lifestyle maintenance. He was claiming he had sacrificed his business career to support my professional development. But the part that made my blood run cold was the future interests clause. His lawyer had inserted a provision asking for a 50% stake in any intellectual property or business ventures developed during the duration of the marriage. He didn't know what Phoenix was yet, but he knew I was a workaholic. He knew I was tinkering, and he was betting that my hobby would eventually pay out, and he wanted his cut. He wasn't just trying to survive, he was trying to colonize my future. I didn't cry. I went to the one person I knew could handle a shark, Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was a divorce attorney who looked like she chewed glass for breakfast. Her office was all glass and steel, located in a building that overlooked the courthouse. I laid the papers on her desk. Sarah read them with a neutral expression that slowly turned into a grimace of disgust. He's asking for $8,000 a month? On what grounds? He's an able-bodied man with business experience. He's claiming he's unemployable because he spent the last 5 years managing our household while I worked, I said, the irony tasting like copper in my mouth. He's claiming he's entitled to half of my tech. Sarah looked at me over her glasses. "Evelyn, tell me the truth. How much is that tech worth?" I hesitated. I just got an inquiry from Nexus Dynamics. We haven't talked numbers, but it's a multi-million-dollar architecture, Sarah, easily. Sarah's eyes sharpened. "Listen to me very carefully. From this moment on, you are broke. You are a struggling developer living in a studio apartment. You do not sign any deals. You do not accept any wire transfers. You do not update your LinkedIn. We are going to drag our feet on this acquisition until the ink on your divorce decree is dry." "But Mark is going to push for a settlement based on potential," I argued. "Let him push," Sarah smirked. "He thinks he's hunting a gazelle. He doesn't realize he's trying to sue a woman who's about to own the whole forest. But if he knows about the Nexus deal, he'll have a legal claim to marital effort. We have to keep Project Phoenix in the dark. We have to make him believe there's nothing to take." The months leading up to the trial were a masterclass in psychological endurance. Mark didn't just sue me, he harassed me. He'd send texts at 2 a.m. "I saw you're still living in that dump. Just sign the alimony agreement, Ev. I'll be generous. You know you can't survive without my help anyway." Or, "My lawyer says you're hiding something. We're going to find it. I'm going to make sure you never work in this industry again." Every message was a test. Every insult was a reminder of the man I'd spent a decade trying to please. I'd forward them all to Sarah. Then I'd go back to my monitors. Nexus Dynamics was getting impatient. They wanted to close. I had to play a high-stakes game of technical delays. I told them I was refining the kernel, that I was waiting on a patent filing. In reality, I was waiting for a court date. I was living a double life.
In the eyes of the law, I was a woman on the edge of poverty, being hounded by a greedy ex-husband. In the eyes of the tech world, I was the next big thing. The pressure was immense. If I closed the deal too early, Mark would get half of my life's work. If I waited too long, Nexus might walk away, and I'd be left with a studio apartment and a massive alimony bill. I was walking a tightrope over a pit of fire, and Mark was at the other end, shaking the rope and laughing, waiting for me to fall. If you want to see the true nature of a person, look at their legal discovery requests. Mark's lawyer, a man named Marcus Sterling, who looked like he was carved out of a block of expensive, cynical granite, didn't just want my bank statements, he wanted my life. They sent over a list of demands that was 50 pages long. They wanted every email I'd sent in the last 2 years. They wanted my browser history. They wanted access to all proprietary code, repositories, and development logs for any projects initiated during the marital period. Sarah Jenkins sat in her office, a red pen in her hand like a surgeon's scalpel, crossing out line after line. Overbroad, harassing, irrelevant, privileged, she muttered. He knows, doesn't he? I asked, watching her work. He suspects, Sarah corrected, looking up. Mark isn't a tech guy, but he's a predator. He knows that when a wounded animal stops crying and starts working in the dark, it's because it's building a weapon. He's fishing, Evelyn. If we give him even a glimpse of the Nexus Dynamics correspondence, he will argue that the intellectual seed of the project was planted while he was supporting you. He'll claim he's entitled to half of the acquisition. While Sarah was fighting the paper war, I was fighting a war against time. Nexus Dynamics wasn't used to waiting. In the tech world, a month is a lifetime. My contact there, a VP named Julian, was calling me every 3 days. Evelyn, the board is getting unrestless. The $3.2 million offer is on the table, but my competitors are starting to look at similar architectures. If we don't move to the intent to purchase phase by the end of the month, I can't guarantee the valuation stays where it is. Why the delay? I sat in my studio looking at a pile of past due utility bills I was holding on to for evidence in the divorce. Julian, I've told you, there's a patent complication. My legal team is ensuring that the architecture is clean of any third-party claims. I want this to be a perfect handoff. It was half a truth. The third party was my ex-husband, but I couldn't tell Julian. If a Tier 1 firm thinks a startup has divorce baggage, they run. They don't buy lawsuits, they buy solutions. I was risking $3.2 million on the hope that I could outrun Mark's greed. Then came the deposition. A deposition is a legal trap disguised as a conversation. You're under oath in a room of people who want to catch you in a lie. Mark sat 3 feet from me, smirking, leaning back in his chair as if he already owned the building. Marcus Sterling started the questioning. He had a voice like silk over sandpaper. Mrs. Vance, or should I say Ms. Vance, you claim in your financial affidavits that you are currently earning less than $60,000 a year as a freelance consultant. Is that correct?
Yes, I said, my voice thin. Sarah squeezed my hand under the table. And yet, you spend upwards of 80 hours a week tinkering, as your ex-husband puts it, on a private server. What exactly is Project Phoenix, Evelyn? My heart skipped. I looked at Mark. He was leaning forward now, his eyes narrowed. He wanted to see me blink. It's a passion project, I said, following Sarah's script. A diagnostic tool. It's an attempt to solve some of the latency issues I saw at my previous firm. It's mostly theoretical at this stage. Theoretical? Sterling smiled, showing too many teeth. We've seen your GitHub activity. It's a lot of code for a passion project. Isn't it true that you've been in contact with major tech firms regarding the sale of this theoretical tool? I've had casual inquiries, I lied, my stomach turning. In this industry, people ask questions all the time. Nothing has materialized. I'm living in a studio apartment, Mr. Sterling. If I had a multi-million-dollar deal, do you think I'd be worried about my electric bill? Sterling stepped back, and for a moment, the room was silent. Then Mark spoke. It wasn't his turn, but he couldn't help himself. "Come on, Ev," he said, his voice dripping with that old, familiar condescension. "You both know you. You're a workaholic. You're hiding the win because you're bitter. But remember who encouraged you when you were just a junior dev? Remember who handled the boring stuff so you could sit in your little dark room and code? You owe me this alimony because I built the environment that allowed you to succeed. You're only where you are because I let you stay there." It was the same gaslighting he'd used for a decade. I let you stay there. As if my brain was his property, as if my midnight oil was his fuel. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the expensive watch I'd bought him for our 3rd anniversary. I saw the arrogance of a man who had never built anything in his life, yet felt entitled to the harvest of someone else's labor. "You didn't build my environment, Mark," I said, my voice finally finding its steel. "You were the weather, and I learned how to build a house that could survive a storm." Sarah cleared her throat. "The witness has answered the question. Move on, Mr. Sterling." The deposition ended with no smoking gun, but Mark's team was emboldened. They thought I was hiding money, but they couldn't prove it. Sterling made a final statement before we left the room. "We will be moving for a forensic audit of your servers, Miss Vance, and we will be asking for a lifestyle analysis of your ex-husband. He has become accustomed to a certain level of support that your career, current or potential, is obligated to maintain." We walked out of the building and into the cold city air. Sarah pulled me aside. "They're going for the audit," she whispered. "If they get a court order for your server, they'll see the Nexus Dynamics architecture. They'll see the draft contracts. We have exactly 3 weeks until the final hearing. If you don't close the deal after the judge says the words, we lose." "And if Nexus walks away before then?" I asked. "Then you're left with nothing but a huge alimony bill and a bitter ex-husband who will spend the rest of his life trying to take your next idea. Set a court date, Evelyn. We need to lure Mark into thinking he's won a modest victory so he doesn't dig any deeper." For the next 20 days, I played the role of my life. I let the forensic auditor look at a sanitized version of my server. I showed them the old, buggy versions of Phoenix. I made sure my studio apartment looked particularly bleak when Mark's legal assistant came by for the asset verification. I even stopped buying the $4 cupcakes. I was living on the edge of a $3.2 million cliff, pretending I was afraid of heights. Mark became overconfident. He started posting on social media about his upcoming justice and new beginnings. He truly believed he was going to get a fat monthly check for the rest of his life, funded by the woman he'd spent years calling unrealistic. He didn't realize that every day he spent gloating was another day closer to the expiration of his claim. He didn't realize that Project Phoenix wasn't just code anymore. It was a countdown. The final hearing was set for a Friday. On Thursday night, I sat in the dark of my studio, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. I had the final acquisition contract from Nexus Dynamics open on the screen. All it needed was a digital signature. I hovered my mouse over the sign button. "Not yet," I whispered to the empty room. "Tomorrow, after the judge says the words." I closed the laptop, went to my mattress on the floor, and for the first time in years, I slept like a queen. The heavy doors of courtroom 4B swung shut with a finality that made the air feel thin. This was it, the culmination of a decade of being told I was unrealistic and a year of living in a studio apartment, eating canned soup sitting on a $3.2 million secret. Marcus Sterling stood up first. He didn't just walk, he glided. He was a man who knew how to use silence to make an audience lean in.
Your Honor, Sterling began, his voice resonant and full of feigned sympathy. This is a simple case of a man who gave his best years to a woman who has now cast him aside like a piece of obsolete hardware. Mark Vance didn't just share a bed, he shared a life. He provided the emotional stability, the domestic management, and the unwavering belief in her projects that allowed her to focus solely on her career. And now, as she stands on the precipice of what we suspect is significant success, she wants to cut the cord and leave him with nothing but a mountain of debt and a shattered lifestyle. I felt a surge of nausea. The way he twisted the narrative was masterful. He was painting Mark as the supportive spouse and me as the cold-blooded tech shark. "I call Mark Vance to the stand," Sterling announced. Mark stood up, smoothing his suit, the one I'd bought him. He walked to the stand with a calculated limp, a touch of stress-induced fatigue. He took the oath with a trembling hand that I knew was pure theater. Sterling began the questioning softly. "Mr. Vance, tell the court about your role in the marriage during Evelyn's development years." Mark looked down at his hands, then up at the judge, his eyes watery. It was a partnership, Your Honor. Evelyn is brilliant, but she's always struggled with the real world. I handled everything. The bills, the grocery shopping, the social obligations. I even helped her brainstorm ideas for her Phoenix project. I'd stay up late with her, bringing her coffee, listening to her talk about code I barely understood, just to make sure she felt supported. I felt Sarah Jenkins' hand grip my arm. "Stay still," her touch said. "Let him dig the hole." "And how did she repay that support, Mark?" Sterling asked. Mark let out a shaky breath. "She started hiding things. She became cold. She'd lock herself in her room for days. When I asked about our future, she told me I was dead weight. She took the skills and the time I gave her and used them to build a wall between us. Now I'm 40 years old. I've been out of the workforce to support her, and I have nothing. I just want what's fair. I just want to maintain the life we built together." Sarah Jenkins stood up. She didn't glide, she marched. She approached Mark with the clinical precision of an interrogator. "Mr. Vance, you claim you supported Evelyn's professional development. Can you tell the court the name of the company Evelyn worked for the last 3 years of your marriage?" Mark blinked. It was something with data in the name. Data tech? Data sys? It was quantum systems, Mr. Vance. And what was her job title? She worked with computers. Senior developer, I think? She was the lead systems architect, Mr. Vance. You claim to have managed the household. In 2024, how much did Evelyn earn in gross salary? I don't know the exact numbers. I handled the vision, not the arithmetic. The arithmetic was $245,000. And in that same year, how much did you contribute to the joint account? Mark shifted in his seat. I was in a pre-revenue phase with my consulting firm. I was building long-term value. The court defines long-term value as actual currency, Mr. Vance. According to your bank records, your total contribution to the marital fund over the last 5 years was $0. In fact, you withdrew over $80,000 for business expenses that include 3 trips to Las Vegas and a diamond necklace that was never gifted to your wife. Is that correct? The judge leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Mark looked at Sterling, but Sterling was busy looking at his notes. Those were networking events, he stammered. Sterling stood up to redirect. He knew he was losing the supportive spouse angle, so he went for the money.
Your Honor, while my client's financial contributions may have been in the growth phase, the respondent is clearly hiding assets. Our forensic auditor has noted significant encrypted activity on her private servers, activity that indicates a major project, Project Phoenix, is near completion. We believe this project has a potential valuation in the millions. We ask the court to delay final judgment until a full valuation of this marital asset can be completed. This was the moment. The Project Phoenix trap was closing. The judge looked at Sarah. Miss Jenkins, does your client have a response to the claim that she is withholding the valuation of a marital asset? Sarah stood up, her face a mask of calm. Your Honor, Project Phoenix was indeed a project initiated during the marriage. However, as my client has testified, it was a theoretical framework with no market interest during the marital period. My client has lived in a studio apartment for a year. She has no secret bank accounts. She has no hidden partners. If Mr. Vance believes this hobby has value, he is welcome to his 50% share of its current liquid value, which, as of this morning's audit, is 0. Mark smirked. He thought he'd won. He thought he was going to get a future interest clause that would tether him to me forever. The judge sighed. It seems we are at an impasse. I cannot value a potential project. I will award spousal support based on the respondent's current income of $60,000. Your Honor, I said, standing up. The room went silent. Sarah looked at me, giving me a microscopic nod. May I address the court regarding my current income? I asked, my voice steady, no longer the frazzled wife Mark had spent a decade creating. The judge nodded slowly. Proceed, Miss Vance. I walked to the front, handing a single sealed envelope to the court clerk. Throughout this trial, my ex-husband and his counsel have called my work a cute hobby. They have called it theoretical. They have claimed that Mark supported the environment that allowed me to create it. I looked directly at Mark. His smirk was fading, replaced by a flickering shadow of doubt. This morning at 9:01 a.m., exactly 1 minute after the court went into session and after the marital asset valuation period officially closed per the temporary orders, I signed an acquisition agreement with Nexus Dynamics. Nexus Dynamics has acquired the full architecture of Project Phoenix for a cash payment of $3.2 million, I said, the words falling like heavy golden coins in the silent room. The deal was finalized after the legal separation of assets. The architecture was cleaned of any marital contribution through a rigorous technical audit conducted by Nexus's own legal team, an audit that proves Mark Vance's only contribution to this project was the atmospheric pressure of his own ego. Sterling was on his feet, shouting, "Objection! This is a bad faith delay. She intentionally withheld the deal to avoid marital sharing." Sarah Jenkins didn't even raise her voice. Objection overruled, Mr. Sterling. The discovery period was open for 6 months. You had every opportunity to subpoena Nexus Dynamics. You chose to focus on lifestyle analysis and Las Vegas receipts. My client followed every court order. She lived in a studio apartment. She didn't accept a dime. If the deal closed today, it is because the market was ready today. Your client wanted half of a hobby. Well, he got it. Half of 0 is still 0. The judge was reading the contract. She looked at Mark, then at me. Mr. Vance, the judge said, her voice like a cold gavel, you spent 20 minutes testifying that this project was a theoretical hobby. Your own counsel argued that it had no current value. You cannot now argue that it is a multi-million-dollar asset simply because the respondent worked harder and smarter than you anticipated. Mark started to sputter. But $3.2 million. I'm the reason she... You are the reason she worked in the dark, Mr. Vance, the judge interrupted. I've seen enough. The request for alimony is denied. The request for future interest in Project Phoenix is denied. Furthermore, based on the evidence of financial misconduct regarding the marital 401k, I am ordering the petitioner to pay the respondent's legal fees in full. I didn't cheer. I didn't gloat. I simply sat down and waited for the judge to finish the decree. Mark was white-faced, trembling with a rage he couldn't voice in front of the bailiff. As the judge stood to leave, the tension in the room snapped. Sterling was already packing his bags, looking at Mark with the disgust a shark has for a fish that didn't provide a meal.
I stood up and walked toward the exit. Mark intercepted me in the aisle. "You think you're so smart, Ev," he hissed, his voice low and vibrating with venom. I stopped. I looked at him, not as a victim, not as a wife, but as an architect looks at a faulty piece of code that's finally been deleted. "I am a nerd in a dark room, Mark," I said, a small, genuine smile touching my lips. "But the room is mine, the code is mine, and for the first time in 10 years, the air is mine too. Enjoy the bill for the legal fees. I'm sure you have a business venture that can cover it." I walked out of the courtroom, the heavy doors swinging shut behind me one last time. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The phoenix had finally risen, and the fire had burned away everything but the truth. Stepping out of the courthouse that Friday afternoon was unlike any sensation I'd ever experienced. The air in downtown didn't feel like city exhaust. It felt like oxygen, pure, unadulterated oxygen. I walked 2 blocks, away from the lawyers, away from the reporters, and away from the ghost of the woman I used to be. I sat on a park bench and did something I hadn't done in 10 years. I sat in silence and didn't feel guilty about it. There was no one to tell me I was being unrealistic, no one to ask where the money was going, and no one to make me feel small for being smart. I pulled out my phone. The notification from my bank was already there. $3,200,000. It was a number on a screen, but to me, it was a shield.
It was the physical manifestation of every midnight hour I'd spent coding while the world and my husband slept. I didn't go buy a Ferrari. I didn't go to a luxury spa. I went to a quiet, high-end bookstore, bought a leather-bound notebook, and wrote on the first page, Day 1. Revenge is often portrayed as a single, explosive moment, but real justice is usually a slow, grinding process. For Mark, the collapse was absolute. Because he had focused his entire legal strategy on the pot of gold at the end of Project Phoenix, he had neglected to build a defense for his own financial misconduct. The judge's order for him to pay my legal fees was a death blow. Between Marcus Sterling's high hourly rate and the forensic auditor's fees, Mark was looking at a bill of nearly $150,000. Without my salary to borrow from and with no actual business ventures to speak of, Mark's lifestyle evaporated overnight. He lost the house, he lost the car, he even lost the social circle he had cultivated using my income. He tried to call me 6 months later. I didn't recognize the number. "Evelyn, it's me. Look, I know things got heated in court, but we were a team once. I'm in a real bind. That diamond necklace, it was an investment. I was going to sell it to help us. Can't you just see past the anger and help me out? Just a small loan, for the sake of what we had." I listened to the message twice, once to confirm it was really him, and once to realize I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, just the cold, analytical observation of a failed system. I didn't reply. I blocked the number. Deleting him from my life was easier than deleting a bug in the kernel. I didn't retire. Why would I? Coding was never the burden Mark made it out to be. It was my heartbeat. I took a portion of the Nexus deal and founded Phoenix Systems. This time, I didn't work in a dark room. I rented the top floor of a refurbished warehouse, all glass and exposed brick, and I hired the best minds I could find. But I did things differently. I looked for the Evelyns of the world, the introverted, brilliant minds, the women and men who had been told their passion was too technical or niche. I built an environment of absolute transparency and psychological safety. No gaslighting, no little hobbies. At Phoenix Systems, the code was the currency, and the architects were the kings. Within 2 years, we had developed 3 more proprietary tools. We weren't just a startup anymore. We were a powerhouse. I was no longer the frazzled wife staying in the background. I was the CEO. I was the keynote speaker at the very conferences Mark had once told me were a waste of money. Standing on that stage in San Francisco, looking out at a sea of thousands, I realized the $3.2 million wasn't the win. The win was the voice I'd found. The win was the realization that my logic wasn't cold, it was a superpower. The hardest part wasn't the money or the business, it was the unlearning. For a decade, I had been conditioned to believe that my worth was tied to someone else's approval. I spent a lot of time in therapy, untangling the knots of Mark's gaslighting. I had to learn that it was okay to be successful. It was okay to be loud about my achievements. It was okay to own the room. I remember the day I finally felt cured. I was in a board meeting, and a potential investor, a man who reminded me slightly of Mark, tried to talk over me. He said, "Evelyn, your technical specs are great, but let's talk about the vision of the market." In the past, I would have shrunken. I would have let him take the lead. This time, I leaned forward, smiled, and said, "The vision is the technical specs. If the architecture isn't sound, the market is just a hallucination. Let's stick to the data, shall we?" The room went silent. He blinked, sat back, and nodded. I didn't feel mean. I felt accurate. 3 years after the divorce, I went back to that same park bench. I was dressed in a simple, high-end suit, holding that same leather-bound notebook. It was almost full. I looked at the courthouse in the distance. It looked smaller than I remembered. The drama, the fear, the 3.2 million mic drop, it all felt like a lifetime ago. I realized then that Mark had been right about one thing. I was a nerd in a dark room, but he was wrong about the darkness. It wasn't a prison, it was a womb. It was where I had grown strong. It was where I'd built the wings that eventually carried me out of the storm. I opened the notebook to the last page and wrote, "End of Volume 1. If you're watching this and you feel like your light is being dimmed by someone who calls your passion a hobby, listen to me. Your brilliance is not their property. Your time is not their resource. Your dreams are not unrealistic just because they can't imagine them." Mark thought he was suing me for money. He didn't realize he was suing me for the privilege of being in my orbit. He lost the money, but more importantly, he lost the source of the light. I am Evelyn Vance. I am a lead architect, I am a CEO, and I am proof that the best revenge isn't just winning the court case, it's becoming the person they told you you could never be. The phoenix doesn't just rise from the ashes, it builds a whole new world from them. And in my world, the air is clear, the logic is sound, and the future is mine.